All right, I want to welcome you to this week's LaRouche PAC class. I'm Susan Kokinda, and tonight Tony Pappert is going to continue the discussion we've been having over the recent period of the unique character of the economics of Lyndon LaRouche. I want to reference back to the class which Bob Ingram presented last week on the American principle of sovereignty, because I want to read the quote which he used at the outset of his class, because I think it's very relevant to setting the appropriate mindset for discussing LaRouche's concept of economics, which really comes from a completely different place than what most people think of as economics, whether it's the liberal Keynesian insanity or the so-called conservative Friedmanite or Austrian school version of that kind of insanity. The quote that Bob started with was a quote from Donald Trump during his presidency, in which he said, "Strong sovereign nations allow individuals to flourish in the fullness of life intended by God." And again, there's something very unique there. That is the question of intended by God. Trump is not talking about some kind of geopolitical structure or some political structure. He's referencing a very profound principle, which is at the core of Lyndon LaRouche's economics, which is that human beings have something which is unique and which sets them above the animals. God-given creativity, God-given capability to reason, God-given capability to exert greater dominion over nature. And that is the driving principle of Lyndon LaRouche's economics. Tonight, Tony is going to explore Lyndon LaRouche's 4 new laws, as he named them when he promulgated them back about 8 years ago. And I want to counsel people, never, never, never take these as a series of recipes in terms of how to address our economic crisis. What Tony will develop tonight is that this is all driven by a fundamental principle, which is grounded in this question of what is your image of man, that we are in the image of the Creator. And that's what drives the concepts. That's what drove Alexander Hamilton when he developed the American system of national banking and public credit over 200 years ago. It's what drove Abraham Lincoln when he resurrected that system. And it's certainly what drove Lyndon LaRouche as he put those principles on an even more scientific basis. So without any further ado, I want to turn it over to Tony.
Great. Thanks so much, Susan. At a time when a few cowards are jumping ship and deserting President Trump and turning against him, it's time for those of us who are not cowards to assess the situation, see where we stand. Now, what we're doing is we're preparing for a great, broad, massive Trump presidential campaign, in far bigger and far more sweeping than in 2016 or in 2020. It's going to be much, much bigger than the Republican Party. It's going to feature the American working class and at the center, and the needs and the role and the critical role in our society, in our economy, of the American working class. But it's going to be far broader than that. And this must sweep the country. It must defeat the opposition of the ruling class, the oligarchy, financier aristocracy, and place President Trump in the White House again, far more securely than he was placed in the White House in 2017. So that's what we have to do now. And there's certain elements of it which I think are not only critically important, but uniquely or almost uniquely in the purview right now of people like you who are joining us tonight. And that's really, as I see it, two interrelated elements. And this was foreshadowed in the email we sent for this class. One, and they're really closely related. One is the readiness to rule. I mean, President Trump, when asked, I forget by who, what his biggest mistake in his first term was, he said only one mistake: people, people, and people. He chose the wrong people, but in large part, the right people weren't there, weren't available. And, he had to choose from what was available with a great many fits and starts, as everybody's aware. We can't repeat that problem in the second term. There has to be a broad field of qualified Americans available to serve in Washington, in elected posts, in appointed posts, in state governments, in local governments, and as citizens to rule this country. In the role of citizens, this country is ruled, as the Constitution says, by we the people. So the readiness to rule, which of course everybody realizes was not present in 2017 because of the moral failure of my generation and to a lesser extent preceding generations in America. Now, intimately linked with that question is economics, basic economics. And as Susan just said, I mean, we're talking about true economics, the economics of the American system, not the economics taught in colleges, universities, and even most of the conservative institutions, which are merely varieties of monetarist British economics, which were vigorously opposed by our founding fathers, the group of our founding fathers who created our Constitution and the Washington administration, and by Lincoln and his advisors when it came their turn to launch an American economic miracle. It was rejected in practice also by the Roosevelt administrations, especially during World War II, when they again relaunched an American economic miracle. So it's not that British school, which is what you get from most schools in this country. It's not this British school we have to master, but the American school of economics, which was carried much further forward by Lyndon LaRouche during approximately 50 years of his life, or 50 or 60 years of his life, beginning around 1950. Or actually, in some respects, he began earlier. So that's the economics. And I mean, as you will see, we're not talking about economic formulas. We're not talking about picking stocks in the stock market or the kind of economic commentary you see in most of the media. We're talking about principles of economics, which, as we'll see in the course of the discussion, they're closely interlinked and partly inseparable from principles of morality, culture, science in general, and all these things are intimately connected. And as I think you'll begin to see by the time we finish, maybe with the help of discussion with you on the line, it's economics in this sense, which is critical to forging the broad coalition of forces which we require today, beginning today, to sweep President Trump into office over the exacerbated lawless opposition of this whole oligarchical stratum and all their sympathizers. Now, the place to begin this discussion is with the question of the future. I mean, what is morality? What is the morality which leads us, you and me, to spurn and mock the calls to abandon President Trump and go with some 57 varieties flavor of the day of Bushy type politicians who are trying to act as though they intend to win the Republican nomination, whether that actually happens or not. It's the morality which leads us to do that. And I mean, which will lead us to do that even when we have to take risks, undergo sacrifices to do that, is the knowledge of the future. And that's the essential point to begin to understand actual American system economics. To begin with, LaRouche always pointed out that the great scientists, Johannes Kepler, who effectively discovered the solar system, Albert Einstein of the last century, actually born in the 19th century and lived mostly in the 20th. These men, as great scientists, they had within them the picture of the future. That may not be too hard to understand. I'm reminded that, we just had Mozart's birthday, and I'm reminded that the composer Franz Schubert, who was a tremendous admirer of Mozart, wrote a tribute to him, saying, "Immortal master, how many images of a better world have you stamped upon our souls?" So he saw in Mozart's music the picture of a better world to come. So, this is true of the great artist. It's true of the great scientist. But it's ultimately true of every human being. It's a human characteristic. The indwelling of the future is an expression of humanity per se. It's an expression of the immortality of the human personality. This was and many of them probably not aware of it, but this was a mode of English poetry before Chaucer in the 14th century, or included Chaucer, and before Chaucer's time, vision poetry. The best example, the most beautiful, is the 14th century, that is the 1300s poem, Piers Plowman, or a fuller title, The Vision of Piers Plowman. The plowman was the man with the high technology, and a peasant could not afford a plow, but the man who had a plow and knew how to operate it and repair it and so on and so forth, as it happens in, unfortunately, many parts of the world today, rented his services out to farmers. And that was the plowman. That was Piers the plowman, who had a vision of a better world, which is what the poem's about. And in fact, it follows a age-old form of vision poetry. Piers, meaning we would call him Pierre, fell asleep on the bank of a river in the springtime, and he had a vision of the present English society with all its failings and problems, and a vision of the better world of the future. I mean, what Lyndon LaRouche said on this, and I mean, he's not the only one, but he said it very well, was that it is the noetic principle which is sacred. The noetic principle is the principle of creative reason. I mean, it is this in man which is made in the image of God. Creative reason in the image of God, the creator. Lyndon LaRouche said, it is the noetic principle which is sacred, the power of foreknowledge of a revolutionary change in the future of mankind. He said, any adult human personality who does not know a relatively efficient prescience, i.e. foreknowledge, of the actual future of history in some significant degree, is intellectually the case of a damaged mind of that human personality. Each of us carries within us the image of the future, the picture of the future, which is essential to our identity as people, because it carries our distinguishing mark as human beings from the entire animal kingdom, which is creative knowledge, which is the knowledge of the future, just as with a great scientist. I mean, the same thing as with a great scientist, even if it's much more developed as such in a great scientist or a great musician, a great composer like Mozart. So what is it? What is the ruling principle of economy? It's the same thing. It's the principle of the future. And I mean, Donald Trump, who Susan, appropriately quoted right at the beginning, Donald Trump is very aware of this and shows it, as other great leaders have been. It's the future of fusion power, which now we see as an immediate future. I mean, because we had a breakthrough, a fusion break-even, greater than a break-even, at Lawrence Livermore, December 5th of last year. So fusion power is now immediately on the horizon. What LaRouche and his movement have fought for 50 years or more. It's now immediately on the horizon. It can be done. But the future of fusion power, still in the future, but much closer, is what guides us today in the exploitation of fission power. And when we've published Project Prometheus, we're calling for an additional 100 full-scale fission power plants in the United States. We need this just to bring our level of power production up to the point where we can bring back the industry from overseas and make the United States, as President Trump said, into a great manufacturing superpower. We need those 100 nuclear power plants, but the way we do it is guided by the future of fusion power. Similarly, LaRouche wrote, and this was back in 2009, where I was reading it, LaRouche wrote that the future colonization of Mars is what guides our return today under Trump's Project Artemis to the moon. The future exploration of Mars guides us today in sending man back to the moon and industrializing the moon. That's the Artemis project. It's guided by the future colonization of Mars, which will be undertaken from the moon. So it's the future which rules the present in economy, in real economy. And of course, I mean, it's worth noting, I mean, President Trump had exactly the same idea. When he was running Project Artemis, the moon mission from the White House, Bridenstine was Trump's NASA administrator. I saw Trump on television tell Bridenstine, don't think so much about the moon, think of Mars. Our progress to the moon is to be guided by our future colonization of Mars. That's what should be on your mind. The future of Mars governing the present or the immediate, further future of Mars governing the more immediate future on the moon. So I think with that, Susan had independently selected a short statement by Lyndon LaRouche from 2011, which was videotaped, which is on precisely this topic and takes us from that introduction to closer consideration of his paper, Four Laws, which we're discussing. So if you could play that, Susan, that'd be great.
Credit, you know, is a funny thing, because you're talking about credit, you're not talking about peanuts. You're talking about a investment by more than one generation. All of the great projects which we need now, as in the past too, are projects which require a multi-generational investment. They require the incurrence of debt, a debt which spans generations. And one of the great things that we have to master in this respect is what is the nature of human beings, or what should be the recognized nature of human beings and their adopted purpose in living. Now we think, well, we die and that's it. That's a popular view. There's some mystical views which really shouldn't be popular because they don't make any sense. But what is the thing that can be done which bridges life from one life through death to another life? What is that connection? So mankind, after all, is not simply another animal which dies in its time, as every animal does. Mankind is something different. Mankind has something that no animal has: the power of creativity, the power of introducing a higher state of organization by the human will. And no species on this planet otherwise has ever been able to do that. Therefore, we do not simply die, though that often happens to us. The people go on from one life to another life following, and they don't see much of a connection between the two. The point is to have a purpose in life which transcends death. And this is only possible through the creative powers of mind of the human individual. And therefore, this leads to what? It leads to something that no animal knows: credit. Credit. Because the things we invest in are the things that we create, things which transcend the death of people, of individuals. The investment of a life in a transition to a new life, which is a continuation of the old, even though the persons who were succeeding one another have died. So therefore, the idea of credit is not a physical or financial conception. The idea of credit, first of all, is human. And no species known to us, other than human beings, know what credit is. It doesn't exist for anything except human beings, to our knowledge. Therefore, we design a monetary system, or a financial system, is based on a system of credit, which means the development of one individual who transmits something which is of use to a second generation. And this is not a process of continuation, it's a process of development. And the unit of development is what we should call credit. Now, this was something that has been understood for a long time by some people. But this system, this concept of credit, is unique as a worked out system to the United States. This was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example, was a system of credit. The system authored in the founding of our Constitution was a system of credit. The system of credit is not a monetary system, it's not a cash collection. The system of credit is the transition and the continuation of the activity of a life through the transmission of a continuation of an effort, an intended effort, to a second life and a life beyond that. Credit is history. Credit is human history. And what we're going to require now, in order to get out of this mess which has been created for us in the United States and other places, we're going to have to cancel this idea of money the way it's conceived now. It's conceived as animals who eat or whatever they do and then die. But human activity, a human system, economic system, is not animals dying. A human credit system is the advancement of mankind, the powers of mankind, the accomplishments of mankind from generation to generation. And what the connection among the living and the living that follow them and the living that follow them is credit. That's the true meaning of credit, is that we pledge something to the future. We praise and protect something which was given to us from the past for the future. And the idea of an economic system, a true economic system, a physical economic system, is that, the system of credit. But the content of credit is not cash. The content is not money. The content is not notes and bills of exchange. The content is human creativity. From generation to generation, people die, but humanity must never die. And once we have that concept, we've got it right.
Terrific. Yeah, thanks so much. Speaking again, it's we do not really die, as Edgar Allan Poe wrote, and clearly Lyndon LaRouche did not really die, and here he is. So I don't know how much I should say about it, but you contrast this with economics as it's taught today, which is based in most elementary way on the false notion that money has an intrinsic value from the past, and money is merely, but I mean, this is all baloney. Money is merely a means. It has no intrinsic value, and its most important function is not what they teach you in Economics 101 of a medium of exchange and a store of value. The most important function is as credit, money as credit, and obviously its value, which is not a number, but a value. Its value, it comes from the future, as you see, stated very vividly with a lot else by Lyndon LaRouche. So the four laws call for the replacement of a monetary system under which we suffer now, under the Federal Reserve, with a credit system where we get rid of this Federal Reserve and substitute a Bank of the United States as a national credit institution. Now, I mean, I'll describe it a bit more slightly differently, but let me make another point first. Now you can begin to see why it is that mastery of basic economics, our economics, American system economics, not the contrary, British economics, you can see why mastery of economics is essential to weld together the broad movement of all kinds of strata of our population, bar none. I mean, we are going to be represented in every section of the country, socially, economically, ethnically, and so forth. Why the essential glue to weld that together is economics, this economics, American system economics. It's not simply confined to, questions of paychecks, stocks, and whatnot. This is essential because this is essential to history. It's through the mastery of this economics that we're going to bring the whole world, America leading the way, bring the whole world up from a present plunge into catastrophe into a new renaissance. This is essential to our culture, essential to our family formation, our life. This economics is one with our culture, with our morals, with our ethics, with our day-to-day life in every sphere. So, I mean, it's the essential ingredient of a renaissance. And a renaissance is what we need now, coming from the dismal 20th century, a trip into a dark age with a few bright spots, into the dismal current 21st century, heading into a dark age again with a few bright spots. What we need to turn the world around is a renaissance, and what we need for such a renaissance is a mastery of economics in our government, and for it to happen in our government against all the bitter resistance of our financiers, our foundations, our oligarchical families, and so forth, the top 1/10 of 1%. To defeat all that resistance, we need a movement which brings virtually everybody together, and this way we can do it. Let me just discuss briefly something which is much in the news, which is that, as I think you're probably all aware, President Biden and his propagandists insist that the Republicans, in the House of Representatives at least, intend to cheat Americans of the Social Security and Medicare that they've paid for. Now, Kevin McCarthy and the leading Republicans say they don't intend to do anything of the sort, but it's convenient for Biden to say so because he steered us into an artificial debt crisis. He wants to use it to try to break the Trump movement to the extent he can around these questions of social services by engineering an unnecessary or bringing us toward a totally unnecessary default on the US debt. Biden wants to cripple our movement, or people who tell him what to think. They want to cripple our movement or destroy it if they can. And one of their points is Social Security. Republicans intend to steal your Social Security, which is not true. But what is the real question of Social Security? Again, is it money? Is it? Or is it simply the question, can we in the United States produce the food, clothing, shelter, transportation, and other needs for our retirees who have paid into the system? Can we produce what they need to live? Well, of course we can produce it. There's no question about it. So why is there any discussion? I mean, they don't eat money. They don't wear money. They don't drive money on vacation. They drive and eat and wear the physical products which we should be producing here, although we're not to a large extent. Can we produce this? Of course we can produce it. So why is there any question about Social Security? It's because of false monetarist economics, because we live not in the republic which we set up in the 18th century, but we live in a monetarist empire of the Federal Reserve and the bankers. It's because of their rules, their laws, their economics, that people imagine there's a problem paying the pensions our people have earned. I mean, you know, Susan Kakinda's on the phone with me, who chronicled this, but if we could go into World War II from a depression, or I mean, go into the build-up to World War II, 1938, from an abject depression earlier, and we could produce one B-24 bomber per hour from Ford's Willow Run plant for World War II. Then, and while we were still producing all the needs for all our civilians and our troops overseas, and not only planes, but tanks and ships and ammunition and all the other things, and still feed everybody perfectly well in the United States at the same time. Now, you know, almost a century later, we can't produce the food and clothing we need for our retirees. It's ridiculous. Of course we can. It's not money which dictates what we do. Money is just intended to mediate or lubricate the process, and most importantly, in the form of credit. This is the most important, as I said a minute ago, this is the most important function of money, not so-called medium of exchange and store of value and the like. Now, the link to the 4 laws is in the was in the email that announced this this class, and we should also place the link in the class as it's posted on YouTube and elsewhere. Just to briefly state at this point, you know, what you'll see when you read it. Point 1, and there's some who say they were misnumbered, should begin with 4, but point 1 calls for a reinstatement of Glass-Steagall. Many of you on this call know very well what that is. Others perhaps don't, but it was the one of the first acts of the incoming Franklin Roosevelt administration in the Depression, which separated the functions of speculative investment banking from commercial banking, so that bad investments of speculative bankers could not destroy our banking system as they did in 2008, 2009, after Glass-Steagall had been repealed in 1999. So it would separate those categories of banks, and of necessity, when the speculative bets had gone bad, as they had in 2007, 2009, as they're going bad now, they would be cut off and ultimately written off, rather than dragging down the system with trillions in bad debt. And again, that is what's going on right now. So as a result, you'd have a commercial banking system purged of these trillions in bad speculative bets. And that commercial banking system would then be free to go into business lending for valid purposes in the real economy. Would not be allowed to do speculative lending, speculative investments, which is pretty much all they do now. But where would you get the credit for them to lend? That's the purpose of point 2. Point 2 calls for the reestablishment of the National Bank of the United States, which would be a source of federal credit for priority programs of physical economy science infrastructure. And a large part of it would be loaned in co-participation through the revived commercial banking system. Point 3 specifies that the purpose of lending is to increase productivity, to increase the negative entropy of the economy, what Bruce especially has been talking about in the preceding classes, to increase the level of technology, to increase the level of capital intensity, to increase the productivity, as I said, and this is reflected in particular in a measure of energy flux density. The flux density of the energy used in production, especially power production, can be approximated by the temperature of the heat source used in power production, which in the case of the fusion breakthrough, for instance, talking about energy density, the case of the fusion breakthrough at Lawrence Livermore on December 5th, I believe the temperature of the fusing gases was, if I remember correctly, 5 times the temperature in the middle of the sun. That's pretty high energy flux density. It's the highest in the solar system. And that's what we achieved. We're going to go further than that. And then point 4 of the 4 laws calls for a crash program for fusion power. And then, then he goes on after point 4, and it's kind of a postscript. Again, I encourage you all of you to read this, which is Vernadsky's discoveries bearing on man and creative mentation. And I don't think there's any way I can do justice to this in a moment right now. In a sense, it's been background to some of what I've said earlier, but the entire short paper ends by an invocation of a man's exploration and mastery, not only of nearby solar space, but ultimately of the solar system as a whole, so that man moves on to become, in practice, what we always were as human beings, which is really a universal species, not by this presence within us of creative mentation, which is, in a sense, what powers the whole universe. We are not an earthbound species in our inmost nature, but a universal species. And many of you are aware of such concepts in religion, but a similar concept exists in science. So that's an approach to the 4 laws of Lyndon LaRouche, and going back to where I started, to our job now in the process of launching a presidential campaign like none other that's ever been seen in our country or anywhere else in the world. It's going to put 2016 and 2020 completely in the shade, and we must do so, and we can. So with that, I'd love to hear what you have to say.